Is it possible for a soul to be hidden from the world, yet chosen to bring forth a message that will touch all hearts? Good evening, dear listener. Wherever you may be, thank you for joining us. Perhaps you are curled up in a quiet corner of your home, or perhaps in the soft glow of evening, on a peaceful journey of your own. We are grateful for this shared moment, where we invite you into the story of a woman who was hidden from the world's eyes, yet destined to change the course of faith forever. Before we begin, kindly consider subscribing to Saint Lives, so we may continue sharing the stories of those whose legacies continue to guide us. Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque's journey is one of silence, suffering, and unwavering faith. Behind her fragile health and quiet demeanor lay a soul chosen by Jesus to reveal one of the greatest devotions in Catholic history, the devotion to the Sacred Heart. In this journey, we will uncover the painful truths of her life, where rejection, isolation, and divine election intertwined to shape a saint who transformed the hearts of the faithful. From the moment of her birth on July 22, 1647, in the small town of Lautecourt, France, Margaret Mary Alacoque seemed destined for a life of quiet obscurity. Her parents, devout and loving, could not have foreseen the great sorrow and the extraordinary grace that would follow. Her father, Claude Alacoque, passed away when Margaret Mary was just 8 years old, leaving her mother, Philiberte, to raise their 3 children in a world marked by growing financial strain. In her childhood, Margaret Mary was a quiet, delicate child, prone to sickness and frailty. Yet, even in her fragile health, there was something striking about the way she carried herself, an inner strength hidden beneath her soft exterior. The passing of her father left an indelible mark on her young soul, one that would shape the course of her spiritual journey. It was in these early years that Margaret Mary began to seek solace in her devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. She would often pray fervently before the statue of the Virgin, finding comfort in her intercession. As she grew, her faith deepened, becoming the wellspring from which she would draw strength in the years to come. Her early years were not only marked by familial hardship, but by the death of her beloved father, which left her feeling orphaned in the world. Yet, even in the midst of sorrow, God seemed to be preparing Margaret Mary for a destiny that would transcend the confines of her small village and the fleeting nature of earthly things. By the time she was a teenager, the young Margaret Mary was already aware of the deep stirrings within her soul, a longing for something greater, something beyond the ordinary world. She spent much of her time in prayer, seeking to draw closer to God. This devotion, however, did not shield her from the trials that lay ahead. Her health continued to be fragile, and she struggled with the physical limitations that often kept her confined to the house. Yet there was a certain peace in her suffering, a quiet acceptance that deepened her relationship with the divine. At the age of 24, the desire to consecrate her life to God became irresistible. Margaret Mary entered the Visitation convent at Paray-le-Monial, a place that would become central to her spiritual mission. There, in the quiet solitude of the convent, she hoped to find the peace and clarity she so longed for. Yet, despite the solemnity of the convent, Margaret Mary's life would not be one of ease or comfort. Her frail health and gentle nature made it difficult for her to fully immerse herself in convent life. The other sisters, busy with their own work, often failed to understand her delicate constitution, and some even questioned her commitment to the monastic life. Margaret Mary endured their indifference and harshness in silence, carrying her burdens without complaint. But it was not just the physical difficulties that would challenge her. It was the spiritual trials that lay ahead, trials that would test her faith in ways she could not yet imagine. In these early years at the convent, Margaret Mary's spirituality blossomed in silence. She spent long hours before the Blessed Sacrament, praying with an intensity that few could understand. Her heart was consumed with a desire to draw nearer to God, to offer her entire being as a sacrifice to His will. But it was not simply the act of devotion that marked her path. Margaret Mary was soon to experience something far more profound, visions that would transform her life and the course of history. Yet these visions, filled with the love and the suffering of Christ, would not be welcomed by all. The first of these mystical experiences came in 1673, a turning point in her life that would set the course for the remainder of her journey. In this vision, Jesus appeared to her, His sacred heart burning with love, and yet wounded by the ingratitude of mankind. He called her to a mission that would become her life's work, to spread devotion to His sacred heart, a devotion that would be a means of bringing sinners back to God through love and reparation. But how could she, a young nun with little strength and fewer supporters, carry such a heavy burden? How could a fragile soul, rejected by many, be the vessel of such a profound message? Margaret Mary did not know the answer to these questions, but she trusted in God's plan for her life. She knew that her mission would not be easy, and it would cost her much more than she could have imagined. Still, she began to share her visions with the superiors in the convent, believing that she had been entrusted with a divine message. However, her words were met with skepticism and suspicion. Some thought her visions were mere figments of her imagination, the product of a fragile mind. Others believed that her claims were too bold and too dangerous, threatening the delicate harmony of convent life. The rejection was swift, and Margaret Mary found herself isolated even further. The same sisters who had once been her companions now viewed her with distrust, and her superiors, rather than providing her with the support she so desperately needed, placed even greater burdens upon her. Yet, through all the rejection, Margaret Mary did not falter. She remained steadfast in her belief that the visions she had received were not from her own mind, but were the voice of God calling her to a greater mission. In the solitude of her suffering, Margaret Mary's faith deepened. The pain of rejection, the weight of misunderstanding, and the ongoing struggle with her own health became the crucible in which her soul was purified. It was through this hidden suffering, unnoticed by the world, that she was being shaped into the vessel of grace that God had chosen. Her journey was one of deep inner conflict, yet it was also a journey of trust. In the silence of the convent, in the rejection of her peers, she came to understand that true holiness wasn't found in accolades or approval, but in faithfulness to God's will, even when it seemed incomprehensible. And so, with each passing day, Margaret Mary carried her burden in silence, offering her suffering as a prayer that would eventually bear fruit for the entire Church. Little did she know that this hidden life, this life of rejection and solitude, would be the foundation of a devotion that would spread across the world. Through her suffering, God was preparing Margaret Mary to be the bearer of one of the greatest messages of love ever given to humanity. The weight of Margaret Mary's mission continued to grow as the years passed, and with it, so did the isolation she endured. Her health, already delicate, grew worse with each passing day. Yet despite her physical frailty, she found strength in the quiet intimacy of prayer. The visions continued to come, clear, vivid, and filled with a message she could not deny. Jesus, in these encounters, revealed to her the deep mysteries of His sacred heart, the heart that burned with divine love for all mankind, but was deeply wounded by the rejection of sinners. The Sacred Heart was to be a symbol of God's infinite love, mercy, and compassion, a love that called all people back to the Father through devotion and reparation. These experiences were not only spiritual gifts, but they carried with them a heavy responsibility. Margaret Mary knew that she was being called to a life of obedience, suffering, and quiet endurance. Yet how could she, a humble and sickly nun, convey such a message to the world? How could she make others believe in the truth of her visions when she herself was met with such resistance? Her superior, Mother de Saumaise, was particularly skeptical of Margaret Mary's claims. The nun's profound spiritual experiences, though undeniable to Margaret Mary herself, were viewed with suspicion by the convent leadership. The sisters whispered behind her back, questioning her sincerity and her mental state. The visions she received, though undeniably profound, were seen as distractions, even dangerous to the orderly life of the convent. Rather than support her mission, the leadership of the convent sought to suppress the very voice that was meant to bring about a profound change in the world's spiritual life. In fact, Margaret Mary's superiors were so troubled by her claims that they sent her to the infirmary for a time, hoping that the isolation would ease the turmoil surrounding her. But even in her solitude, Margaret Mary did not stop praying, did not cease offering her sufferings to God. Her time in the infirmary, though painful, became a time of great spiritual fruit. It was there, alone with her thoughts and her visions, that she grew even closer to the Lord. And it was there that the Lord revealed to her even greater depths of His love. Through all of this, Margaret Mary remained faithful, trusting that God's plan for her would unfold in His time, not hers. She knew that the message she had been given was not for her alone, but for the world. The Sacred Heart, a symbol of love, mercy, and reparation, would one day become a powerful devotion embraced by millions. But for now, Margaret Mary's role was to live in obedience, even in the face of rejection. She did not know how or when her message would be accepted, but she trusted in the divine wisdom that had called her to this sacred task. Despite the burdens she carried, her heart was filled with peace. She continued to pour her life into prayer, offering herself as a living sacrifice for the Church and for the world. But even in the midst of her unwavering faith, the trials Margaret Mary endured were profound. Her health continued to deteriorate, and her physical suffering increased with each passing day. Yet, as her body grew weaker, her spirit grew stronger. It was in the silence of her suffering that she found a profound union with Christ. She began to see her afflictions as a participation in the suffering of Christ Himself. Her physical pain became a means of drawing closer to Jesus, of sharing in the love He demonstrated on the cross. This deep union with Christ, though difficult and painful, brought her great spiritual joy. She began to see the suffering of the world through a new lens, not as something to be feared, but as something that could lead to deeper intimacy with God. Margaret Mary's willingness to suffer for the sake of others, to endure rejection and isolation, became a powerful witness to the power of divine love. Still, the road ahead was not easy. Her superiors continued to question her, and her fellow sisters remained skeptical. But in the face of these difficulties, Margaret Mary found a source of strength in her spiritual director, Father de la Colombière. Father de la Colombière, a Jesuit priest who had come to Paray-le-Monial in 1675, was the first person to truly believe in Margaret Mary's visions. He encouraged her to remain steadfast in her faith and to trust that God was using her to bring about a new devotion that would touch the hearts of many. With his support, Margaret Mary began to open up more fully about her mystical experiences, sharing the details of her encounters with the Sacred Heart. Together, they began to pray for the spread of this devotion, trusting that God would bring it to fruition in His own time. Yet even with Father de la Colombière's guidance, Margaret Mary's life continued to be marked by rejection. Her fellow sisters could not understand the depth of her experiences, and they often mocked her for her piety. They could not comprehend why she endured such suffering and isolation, nor could they see the profound spiritual depth that underlay her visions. But Margaret Mary did not seek their approval. She knew that her true mission was not to win the approval of her fellow sisters, but to remain faithful to the message she had received. She had been chosen by God for a unique task, and her heart was fixed on fulfilling that mission, no matter the cost. As the years passed, the devotion to the Sacred Heart, though still struggling to find its place, began to spread. The small community at Paray-le-Monial became a center of spiritual activity, as Margaret Mary's experiences continued to resonate with those who were open to the message of divine love and reparation. But even as the devotion began to take root, Margaret Mary's health continued to fail. She was often bedridden, weakened by the physical demands of her suffering. But even in her frailty, she remained steadfast, always faithful, always focused on the mission entrusted to her by Christ. She knew that her time on earth was limited, and yet she pressed forward, trusting that God would bring her work to fruition in His time. Margaret Mary's life, though marked by suffering and rejection, became a testament to the power of divine love. Her willingness to endure hardship for the sake of others, her devotion to Christ's Sacred Heart, and her unwavering faith in God's plan all contributed to the eventual spread of the devotion that would change the spiritual landscape of the Church. Though she was hidden from the world, her message, carried in the quiet strength of her suffering, would one day be known to all. The devotion to the Sacred Heart became a beacon of love and mercy, drawing souls closer to the heart of Christ. And in the hidden life of Margaret Mary Alacoque, God's plan unfolded, transforming the hearts of the faithful and drawing them into a deeper union with the divine heart. Gently continuing from where the last part left off, we follow Margaret Mary deeper into the unfolding of her mission, as the tender yet consuming light of the Sacred Heart continued to illuminate her hidden path. Though her body remained frail, and her place within the convent uncertain, the call within her soul grew stronger day by day. It was in the quiet folds of 1675, during the feast of Corpus Christi, that the message she had been receiving began to take a more definitive, almost urgent form. In one of the most profound visions she would ever experience, Jesus revealed His heart to her, radiant, burning, encircled with thorns, and spoke to her with a sorrow that pierced the deeper chambers of her being. He lamented the coldness and indifference of humanity, especially the ingratitude shown to Him in the Eucharist. He spoke of His desire for a feast in honor of His Sacred Heart, a day in which the faithful would offer acts of reparation for the wounds inflicted upon Him by sin, neglect, and forgetfulness. This request, coming directly from the Lord Himself, filled Margaret Mary with awe and trembling. How could she, a humble and often misunderstood nun, convey such a monumental request to the world, much less to her own community, which struggled to accept even the smallest aspects of her inner life? Yet the Lord's instruction was clear. She was to spread devotion to His Sacred Heart, to help establish the feast, and to encourage acts of love and reparation. Margaret Mary felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being asked of her, and she turned immediately to Father de la Colombière, the one person on earth who believed her without hesitation. When she confided her vision to him, he listened with the steady discernment of a man deeply anchored in the spiritual life. His conviction grew that this message was indeed from God. He urged her to trust in divine providence and to embrace the mission fully. With his support, she wrote down the details of her visions and the requests made by Christ. But while Father de la Colombière understood the supernatural origin of the devotion, the rest of the convent remained unconvinced. In fact, the more she spoke of the Sacred Heart, the more her sisters recoiled, feeling threatened by the intensity of her inner experiences and wary of anything that appeared extraordinary in the quiet routine of monastic life. The Visitation Order had been founded to be a place of gentleness, humility, and quiet virtue. Anything resembling boldness or unusual spiritual manifestations risked disrupting the delicate balance of the community. Thus, Margaret Mary's experiences were often interpreted not as divine gifts, but as personal exaggerations or mental instability. This misunderstanding pained her deeply, yet she continued to submit herself to the scrutiny of her superiors. She endured humiliating tests of obedience, long days of silence, and at times the fear that her own conscience would become clouded with doubt. What if, she wondered, she was indeed mistaken? What if the visions were not from God, but from her own imagination? But each time the thought crossed her heart, the Lord would speak again in the depths of her soul, quietly, tenderly, reassuring her of His presence, strengthening her resolve, and renewing the mission entrusted to her. Even so, the internal conflicts did not ease. The convent leadership grew increasingly uncomfortable with the attention Margaret Mary's spirituality was receiving. Her fervor, her visions, even her radiant calmness after long hours of prayer, all of it seemed to unsettle those around her. Some sisters whispered in the cloisters that she was trying to make herself special. Others, less cruel but still uncertain, wondered whether she was being deceived by the devil. Margaret Mary never defended herself. She simply accepted their judgments in silence and offered each hurt as a hidden sacrifice to the Sacred Heart. Her humility, however, did not shield her from the emotional exhaustion of being constantly misunderstood. There were nights when she cried alone in the darkness of her cell, not because she doubted God, but because she felt too weak to bear the weight of such a profound calling on her own. But God did not abandon her. As her inner battles intensified, Jesus spoke to her again, showing her His heart consumed with flames of love, and telling her that her suffering was not in vain. He revealed that the devotion He was planting through her would one day renew the Church, soften hardened hearts, and bring countless souls back to Him. He assured her that her mission would face resistance, but that the fruit it would bear would be abundant, far surpassing the trials she had endured. This promise became Margaret Mary's anchor. Each time she was shamed or dismissed, she returned to prayer and surrendered her pain into the heart of Christ, trusting that He would guide the unfolding of His design in His own perfect way. Despite the challenges, her relationship with Father de la Colombière continued to grow in a way that fortified her spirit. He became not only her confessor and director, but also a witness to the authenticity of her mission. He helped her articulate her experiences with clarity, grounding her mystical life in the teachings of the Church. He encouraged her to write everything down, her visions, her inner struggles, her revelations, so that the truth of her experiences could be preserved, not only for the sake of discernment, but also so that one day future generations might understand the origins of the devotion. But this strong spiritual support came at a cost. In 1676, Father de la Colombière was reassigned to England. The news struck Margaret Mary like a blow to the heart. Losing the only person who understood her, the only voice that validated her mission, plunged her into a new and darker form of loneliness. She tried to remain composed before the sisters, but in the solitude of her cell, grief overtook her. How could she carry the message alone? How could she withstand the doubts of her community without the steady presence of her director? Yet, in this sorrow, she began to understand another layer of her mission. She was to share not only the revelations of the Sacred Heart, but also the suffering of that heart. If Jesus accepted the abandonment of friends, If he embraced the cross in silence, then she too would accept the loss of her spiritual companion. It was a painful lesson, but it deepened her union with Christ. She began to embrace her solitude as a form of participation in his own loneliness, especially in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he had been left alone in prayer while his disciples slept. This spiritual identification strengthened her resolve. And though Father de la Colombière was physically far away, he remained spiritually connected to her until his death in 1682. His final letters, written with gentleness and trust, assured her that he continued to believe in her mission, even as his own health declined. After his passing, she felt his protection from heaven, like a quiet light that accompanied her in her darkest hours. With the years that followed, Margaret Mary began to see subtle changes within the convent. Some sisters, struck by her unwavering humility and her sincere devotion, softened toward her. Although many still held doubts, the seeds of the Sacred Heart devotion were beginning to take root. A small circle of sisters started to join her in prayer, drawn by the tenderness and peace that seemed to emanate from her communion with Christ. Margaret Mary herself never sought to force the devotion upon anyone. She merely lived it, quietly, steadfastly, allowing her life to become the first living expression of the message entrusted to her. Her suffering, her patience, her love, and her fidelity became the hidden foundation upon which future generations would later build. Yet, despite these small consolations, she remained aware that acceptance was still far from complete. The road ahead promised more trials, more misunderstandings, and more silent crosses. But Margaret Mary had come to understand something profound. It was not results she was called to seek, but fidelity. Her life, she realized, was a hidden offering, an unbroken ribbon of prayer and sacrifice woven into the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And so her story continued, quietly, steadily, like a candle burning in a darkened chapel, holding its flame against the wind. Her life moved gently into its next chapter, one shaped by the slow accumulation of trials that pressed upon her like invisible weights, yet also by a deepening interior peace that became the quiet signature of her soul. After Father de la Colombière's departure and subsequent death, Margaret Mary found herself navigating the convent's demanding rhythm without the one earthly guide who had believed wholeheartedly in her mission. Still, she did not falter. Instead, she sank more deeply into prayer, allowing the Sacred Heart to become her teacher and companion. Her love for Christ grew so tender and so profound that her entire being seemed to rest in the radiance of his affection, even as she faced sternness and suspicion from those around her. Her physical health remained precarious, her body weakening with each passing year, but her interior life continued to expand like a hidden flame sheltered from the winds. She bore her infirmities with serene acceptance, interpreting them not as punishment, but as privileged invitations into the suffering heart of Jesus. It was during this period, when her outer life appeared barren and desolate, that the Lord granted her some of the most consoling spiritual experiences she would ever know, moments of mystical union that left her filled with an indescribable sweetness, a peace so deep that words could never quite capture it. Yet outwardly, the challenges persisted. The convent community was torn between curiosity and caution, admiration and mistrust. Some sisters witnessed the gentleness of her disposition and the radiance that seemed to accompany her prayer, and they wondered privately if her visions were indeed from God. Others remained skeptical, interpreting her experiences as excesses of imagination or emotional intensity. Margaret Mary never responded to these divisions. She did not defend herself, nor did she seek to persuade those who doubted her. Instead, she continued to live as she always had, quietly, obediently, offering each humiliation as a hidden act of love. Her silence itself became a form of preaching, a living witness to the Sacred Heart she adored. Sometimes she was given the most menial tasks, intentionally assigned to test her humility. At other times, she was excluded from decisions or community matters because her visions were perceived as unsettling. But none of this disturbed her peace. She accepted each slight as a rose placed upon the altar of her devotion, each misunderstanding as a way of drawing closer to the suffering Christ. It was in this obscurity that the seeds of the Sacred Heart devotion continued to grow, watered not by public approval, but by the quiet tears and sacrifices of an anonymous nun who asked for nothing in return. As time passed, the Lord continued to guide her with delicate precision. In prayer, He deepened her understanding of His heart. The burning love, the longing for souls, the sorrow He felt over the coldness He received from those He loved. These revelations pierced her with compassion. She longed to console Him, to offer her own life as a balm for the wounds inflicted by human indifference. On several occasions, she experienced mystical visions in which the Sacred Heart appeared to her as a blazing fire of love, surrounded by thorns, surmounted by a cross, and shining with a brilliance that lit the very depths of her soul. These visions did not inflate her pride. Instead, they humbled her further, making her keenly aware of her own smallness and the vastness of God's love. She understood that her mission was not about her worthiness, but about God's desire to reveal His heart to the world. She sensed that the devotion was still in its infancy, that its full flowering would only come long after her death, and that her role was simply to sow the seeds with fidelity. There were also moments of profound darkness, periods when she felt the absence of consolation, when prayer grew dry and her spirit felt heavy. These were the times when doubts tried to creep into her heart, whispering that her visions were illusions, that she had been deceived, or that her suffering would bear no fruit. But even in these nights of the soul, she clung to her mission with unwavering trust. She offered her desolation to the Sacred Heart, believing that even these hidden struggles could serve as acts of reparation. Over time, these interior trials only strengthened her faith. She learned to trust not in her feelings, but in the steadfastness of God's promise, discovering a deeper union that was no longer dependent on consolation, but grounded in pure love. Meanwhile, small signs of change began to appear within the convent. A few sisters, impressed by her humility and moved by her unwavering gentleness, started to imitate her devotion. They knelt beside her in the chapel to adore the Blessed Sacrament. They listened with softened hearts when she spoke quietly about the Lord's love. And though the majority remained cautious, these few were like the first green shoots of a devotion that would one day bloom with fullness. Margaret Mary did not seek to lead them. She did not place herself at the center of their attention. Instead, she gently guided them toward the heart of Christ, always pointing away from herself and toward the one who had entrusted her with this mission. She reminded them that devotion to the Sacred Heart was not merely a set of prayers or practices, but a way of life, an invitation to love as Christ loved, to forgive as He forgave, and to carry one's cross with patience and tenderness. Her words, though simple, carried a depth that touched the hearts of those willing to listen. Even as her influence quietly grew, Margaret Mary continued to face resistance from some of the convent leadership. But a shift began to occur around 1683 and 1684, when unexpected changes in the superiors brought new openness to the message of the Sacred Heart. The new leaders, after observing her closely, recognized the authenticity of her virtue and the sincerity of her mission. They saw how she bore suffering with serene acceptance, how she treated each sister with kindness regardless of how she was treated, and how her devotion was not disruptive, but deeply unifying. Gradually, the atmosphere within the convent softened. Practices associated with the Sacred Heart, once dismissed, began to be introduced. Times of adoration, acts of reparation, and meditations on the love of Christ became more common. The devotion was no longer a solitary flame burning in one hidden soul. It was becoming a quiet but steady light shared among many. For Margaret Mary, this development was not a triumph, but a grace. She remained deeply aware of her unworthiness, and often expressed surprise that God would choose her, a frail, obscure nun, to carry such a message. Yet she also knew that the Sacred Heart had its own designs, unfolding gently in ways she could never predict. Her only desire was to remain faithful to the end, to love Christ with all her strength, and to offer her life as a silent prayer for the world. Her health continued to decline, but she accepted this with peaceful resignation, viewing each moment of weakness as one more opportunity to unite herself with the suffering heart of Jesus. Through all these experiences, one question lingered softly in the air, like a gentle chord awaiting its resolution. How long would it be before the message of the Sacred Heart reached beyond the walls of Paray-le-Monial and began to touch the wider church? That answer, still hidden, waited patiently in the unfolding of God's time. In the gentle unfolding of time, Margaret Mary entered a new phase of her hidden journey, one marked by a quiet maturity in her mission and a deepening union with the Sacred Heart that seemed to permeate every corner of her being. As the years passed, the initial turbulence surrounding her visions had softened into a calmer, more contemplative rhythm within the convent. Though not all her sisters accepted her mission fully, many now observed her with a reverent curiosity, sensing the depth of her interior life even if they could not fully comprehend it. The tide was turning, slowly but undeniably, as the devotion she had carried in silence began to root itself more firmly in the life of the community. This shift was subtle, like the soft light of dawn that seeps gently into a darkened room, illuminating everything without force. Margaret Mary, however, carried no pride in this change. She remained convinced that she was merely a fragile instrument, chosen not for her merit, but for her willingness to surrender. Her only desire was to love and console the heart of Jesus, to be a quiet vessel through which his tenderness might flow. Her days became ever more shaped by prayer, sacrifice, and a serene acceptance of her increasing physical weakness. She found herself frequently too ill to participate fully in convent duties, yet even these limitations became moments of grace. She offered each breath, each step that cost her effort, each sleepless night as reparations to the Sacred Heart. The more her body failed her, the more her soul seemed to expand in its capacity for love. She entered periods of deep mystical contemplation, long, silent hours before the Blessed Sacrament in which she felt enveloped in divine light. These experiences brought her profound peace, but she guarded them with great discretion. She spoke of them only to her spiritual directors, and only when obedience required it. The rest she kept hidden like precious jewels, treasures stored in the secret chambers of her heart. Yet even as her spiritual life soared, the path God traced for her remained marked by continual suffering. Her illnesses often left her bedridden, enduring sharp pains that tested her endurance. She experienced moments of piercing loneliness, the kind that visits those whose souls walk paths few can understand. She endured misunderstandings from those still unsure of her visions, and there were days when the weight of her mission pressed heavily upon her shoulders. But Margaret Mary had learned to read suffering differently. To her, Each trial was not a sign of abandonment, but an invitation into the mystery of Christ's love. She believed that every sorrow united her more intimately with the Sacred Heart, whose wounds were the fountain of divine mercy. Her suffering became the silent language through which she spoke to God, a language richer and more eloquent than any words. During this time, the Lord deepened his revelations to her. At moments when she felt overwhelmed, he would remind her that his heart was her refuge, that her pain was not in vain, and that her mission would bear fruit in ways she could not yet imagine. She came to understand more fully the profound love expressed in the Sacred Heart, the love that seeks souls, suffers for them, waits for them. She desired nothing more than to respond to this love with her whole being. It was during one such experience of prayer that Jesus revealed to her a striking vision of his heart, blazing like a furnace of pure love. He told her that this heart desired to reign in the hearts of all people, that it longed to bring healing, unity, and renewal to a world grown cold. He asked her once more to spread the devotion, not with force or persuasion, but through quiet fidelity. This request, so intimately woven into her vocation, filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. Even in her weakness, she sensed that God was guiding each step of her journey. Despite her growing frailty, she continued to play a vital role in the spiritual life of the convent. She often counseled younger sisters who sought her guidance, offering them simple yet profound advice rooted in humility and trust. Many were struck by the gentleness of her voice, the way she radiated peace even when suffering. They noticed that her presence brought a sense of calm to the community, a quiet reassurance that God was near. Though she held no official position of authority, her influence was felt in the hidden ways that matter most, through example, through prayer, through silent witness. In time, several sisters began practicing the devotion to the Sacred Heart with deep sincerity, joining her in offering acts of reparation and striving to imitate the tenderness of Christ. Her spiritual writings, composed out of obedience, began to circulate quietly within the community. These writings, though simple in language, bore the unmistakable stamp of divine inspiration. They spoke of the immeasurable love of the heart of Jesus, of the need for reparation, of the joy found in surrender, and the peace that comes from abandoning oneself completely to God's will. Some who read them were moved to tears, sensing in her words a depth of wisdom born of suffering. Others found in them a mirror for their own struggles, a reminder that even the most hidden life can become a channel of grace. Over time, her writings reached religious communities beyond Paray-le-Monial, sparking interest in the devotion among other visitation houses. This quiet spreading of the message encouraged Margaret Mary, who saw in it the beginning of the fulfillment of Christ's promises. And yet, even as her influence grew, she remained ever conscious of her own limitations. She often felt unworthy of the grace she had received, aware that her humanity was fragile and imperfect. She sometimes feared the responsibility placed upon her, worried that she would not be able to fulfill it fully. In these moments, she turned once again to the Sacred Heart, drawing strength from the source of all love. Her humility was not a denial of God's work in her, but a recognition that everything she accomplished came from His grace. This humility, so deeply rooted, allowed her to bear the weight of her mission with quiet dignity. As her life continued to unfold in this rhythm of suffering and grace, something remarkable began to happen within the wider church. Word of the devotion to the Sacred Heart began to spread beyond the Visitation order, carried by priests and religious who felt drawn to its message of divine love and reparation. A few bishops expressed interest in the devotion, intrigued by its theological depth and pastoral promise. Without fully realizing it, Margaret Mary was witnessing the early stages of a spiritual movement that would one day unite countless souls. This was not the dramatic triumph she had once feared she might be expected to produce. Rather, it was a gentle, organic unfolding, like ripples spreading outward from a single drop falling into still water. In this subtle growth, she recognized the unmistakable trace of God's hand. Yet for all the progress being made, Margaret Mary felt a deepening sense that her earthly life was drawing toward its close. Her illnesses grew more frequent, her strength diminished, and her once brisk steps slowed to a frail shuffle. She accepted these changes with a quiet peace, believing that her time of offering was nearing completion. She did not fear death. She viewed it as the opening of a door into the heart she had loved so faithfully. Her days were now filled with a serene readiness, a quiet anticipation that she would soon meet the one who had guided her through every sorrow and every joy. She continued to pray fervently, offering every moment for the spread of the devotion and the conversion of souls. Her final years would become a profound testament to the endurance of love, a love that, though hidden, would shape the spiritual landscape of the centuries to come. The quiet years that followed unfolded with a tenderness that seemed to surround Margaret Mary like a soft veil, as though heaven itself were gradually preparing her for her final offering. Though her body had grown increasingly frail, her spirit radiated a calm strength that left a deep impression on those around her. Her sisters, who once regarded her visions with suspicion, now observed her with growing reverence. They noticed how her presence brought a sense of peace to the convent, how her eyes held a depth of compassion that seemed to reach into the very heart of anyone who spoke with her. Some still struggled to understand the supernatural nature of her experiences, but few could deny the sincerity of her virtue or the quiet holiness that now marked her daily life. It was as if the Sacred Heart, whose love had pursued her so relentlessly, had gradually shaped her into its own reflection. She carried herself with a gentleness that softened even the most hesitant hearts, and her hidden mission continued to take root in ways both subtle and profound. But even as the devotion began to blossom more widely, Margaret Mary remained fully aware of how fragile the work still was. She understood that spiritual movements, especially those born from private revelation, required careful guidance and time to mature. She often prayed that the Sacred Heart would protect the devotion from misunderstanding or distortion, entrusting all its growth to God's providence. She felt deeply responsible for the message placed in her care, yet she knew she could not direct its development herself. This humility became one of the most striking features of her character. She never allowed herself to think she was the founder of a movement, nor did she ever imagine her name would one day be associated with the devotion around the world. She saw herself as a small servant, hidden in the folds of Christ's love, whose only task was to remain faithful in silence. This inner posture of surrender gave her an extraordinary serenity, even when confronted with difficulties that would have discouraged many others. Her health continued to decline, though she rarely spoke of it. She had long since accepted physical suffering as a companion, viewing it not as an enemy, but as a means of deeper union with Christ. Nevertheless, there were days when the weakness in her limbs made every step an effort, days when headaches pierced her with a sharp and relentless pain, days when her body trembled under the weight of fever. Her sisters urged her to rest, but Margaret Mary often insisted on participating in community life as much as possible, believing that obedience and charity were among the purest offerings she could give. When she could not rise from her bed, she prayed, offering her illness for the needs of the church and the world. She would whisper, "Everything for the heart of Jesus. allowing each breath to become an act of love. Her suffering never embittered her. Instead, it polished her, like a stone shaped by gentle, persistent waves, revealing the luminous truth of her soul. During these final years, she received several consoling insights from the Lord in prayer. He affirmed to her that the devotion would not only survive, but would flourish, becoming a source of renewal for the Church. He showed her that his heart, long wounded by human indifference, would be honored throughout the world, bringing healing to countless souls. Margaret Mary was overwhelmed by this vision of hope. She did not witness its full realization in her lifetime, but she clung to the promise with quiet certainty. These assurances allowed her to release every anxiety, every fear, every lingering doubt. She had done what she could. The rest belonged to God. There were also moments when she sensed her mission entering a more interior phase. She no longer needed to speak as often about the Sacred Heart, because the devotion had already begun to take root among her sisters. They prayed with greater fervor before the Blessed Sacrament, made acts of reparation, and grew in tenderness toward one another. The atmosphere of the convent had changed, becoming more gentle, more united, more reflective of the love that flowed from the heart of Jesus. This transformation brought immense joy to Margaret Mary, who saw in it the first fruits of the devotion's future triumph. Though she remained physically weak, she felt spiritually fulfilled, as if her soul had entered a place of rest. She often meditated on the wounds of Christ, finding in them the perfect expression of divine love, a love that suffers willingly, forgives generously, and seeks relentlessly. Yet her journey was not without final trials. There were moments when old doubts resurfaced within the community, stirred by those who feared that too much emphasis on the Sacred Heart might distract from the essential teachings of the faith. Some questioned the wisdom of dedicating so much time to reparation. Others worried that the devotion would not be understood by the wider Church. These concerns, though not malicious, weighed heavily on Margaret Mary's heart. She knew that any spiritual work entrusted by God would face resistance, but she also knew that her time for addressing these issues directly was coming to an end. In her growing weakness, she found herself less able to respond to concerns or guide those who doubted. Instead, she entrusted everything once again to the Sacred Heart, believing that divine grace would continue the work after she was gone. This surrender, born of both necessity and trust, marked the final shaping of her vocation. It was during this period that she deepened her devotion to the Eucharist, spending every ounce of strength to be near the Blessed Sacrament. Whenever she could walk, she knelt before the tabernacle, her gaze fixed on the mystery of love hidden beneath the appearance of bread. She often whispered prayers of gratitude, offering her life, her sufferings, and her remaining days in union with Christ's sacrifice. On days when she could not rise from her bed, she asked to be carried near the chapel so she could at least be close to the one she adored. Her union with Christ grew so profound that at times it seemed her soul hovered on the threshold of heaven. Sisters who tended to her in her final illnesses later testified that they felt a sacred presence around her, as though the divine love she cherished had wrapped itself around her like a mantle. Her final months were marked by a quiet anticipation of death, not with fear, but with a serene longing. She often spoke of the Sacred Heart as her refuge and her eternal home. She encouraged her sisters to persevere in the devotion, reminding them that love was the heart of the Christian life. She asked forgiveness from everyone she had ever offended, even in the smallest ways, and offered forgiveness with tenderness to those who had misunderstood or mistreated her. Her humility in these moments touched many deeply, and for some, it became the moment when lingering doubts dissolved completely, They saw in her not only a visionary, but a saint, one whose life bore the unmistakable imprint of God. As her strength waned, the community gathered more frequently around her bedside, offering prayers and companionship. She spoke little, conserving her breath, but her eyes were filled with peace. She whispered occasionally of the Sacred Heart, of love, of surrender. On the night when her final hour approached, she asked to receive communion one last time. She held the host with trembling hands, tears of gratitude filling her eyes. After receiving the Eucharist, she lay back against her pillows and murmured, "I need nothing else. With him, everything is complete." Her breathing grew slower, her face serene, her hands resting gently on her chest. And in the quiet of that night, surrounded by her sisters, Margaret Mary Alacoque surrendered her soul into the heart she had loved so faithfully, her final breath carrying her into the embrace of eternal love. Her passing, though sorrowful for the community, was filled with an unmistakable sense of grace. It was as if a light had ascended gently to heaven, leaving a warm glow that lingered in the hearts of all who had known her. In the days that followed, the sisters felt her presence still, not in visions, but in the renewed peace and unity that seemed to permeate the convent. Her life, once hidden and misunderstood, had now revealed its full beauty, and though she had left the world quietly, the devotion she carried, born in suffering, nurtured in silence, was now destined to flourish far beyond the modest walls of Paray-le-Monial. The death of Margaret Mary left a silence in the convent that felt almost physical, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the gentle radiance of a soul that had departed, leaving behind a space filled with both tenderness and awe. Her sisters moved softly through the halls, speaking in hushed tones, aware that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something quietly transformative. Even those who had once doubted her now felt the echo of her holiness lingering in the very air they breathed. There was no dramatic proclamation, no sudden miracle to force belief, but there was a subtle shift in the hearts of her companions, a recognition that the quiet nun who had suffered so humbly had been chosen for a mission far greater than any of them could have imagined. In the days after her passing, the convent found itself wrapped in a stillness that seemed to invite reflection. Her writings were gathered and read again, her counsel remembered, her acts of charity recalled with increasing reverence. Slowly, her life began to shine with a clarity that had not always been visible while she lived. And with this clarity came an awareness that the devotion she had carried, the devotion to the Sacred Heart, was no longer tied to her alone. It was now theirs to continue. In the weeks that followed, something beautiful began to unfold within the community. The sisters found themselves drawn irresistibly toward the chapel, lingering longer before the Blessed Sacrament, praying with a renewed sense of intimacy and purpose. They began practicing the devotion to the Sacred Heart with greater fidelity, not out of obligation, but out of genuine love. What had once been met with hesitancy now blossomed into a shared longing to console the heart that Margaret Mary had so often spoken of. A heart that loved with tenderness and suffered with patience. The devotion, once confined to a few, now spread gently among the entire convent, its flame catching light in the hearts of those who had once resisted it most. It was as though her death had removed the final barrier to understanding, allowing the fullness of her mission to reveal itself in its true light. Sisters who had once doubted her sincerity now found themselves inspired by her humility and her unwavering fidelity. They saw, at last, that her life had been a living testament to the love she proclaimed. Yet even as the devotion gained strength within the convent, another development began to unfold beyond its walls. word of Margaret Mary's extraordinary life and the message she had received from Christ began to spread slowly among other communities of the Visitation order. Her writings, once kept quietly within Paray-le-Monial, were copied and shared with other monasteries. At first, the reception was cautious. Private revelations were always approached with discernment and care. But the simplicity and purity of her words, combined with the unmistakable depth of her spirituality, touched many hearts. The devotion seemed to carry within it a resonance that called to something deep within the soul, a longing for love, for mercy, for comfort in suffering. It spoke to those who struggled with the weight of their own inadequacies, offering them a glimpse into the boundless compassion of Christ. Gradually, the Sacred Heart devotion began to spread from convent to convent, carried by letters, by whispers, by quiet testimonies of grace. As the devotion took root more widely, the Church began to take notice. Priests who visited Paray-le-Monial spoke of the profound transformation they observed in the community, describing a renewed spirit of charity, unity, and contemplative depth. Some began teaching their parishioners about the Sacred Heart, incorporating elements of the devotion into their homilies and spiritual guidance. They found that people responded with remarkable openness, drawn to the idea of a love that was both tender and strong, both vulnerable and infinite. In a world marked by war, famine, and spiritual confusion, the focus on Christ's wounded heart offered comfort and hope. It provided a way for people to connect personally with God's mercy, to feel seen and loved in their brokenness. The devotion became a balm for weary souls, a reminder that divine love was not distant or abstract, but profoundly intimate. Yet despite these early signs of promise, the devotion's broader acceptance was far from guaranteed. Skepticism remained, particularly among some theologians and leaders who feared an excessive emphasis on sentimentality. Others questioned the validity of private revelations or worried that the devotion might overshadow more established forms of worship. These concerns were not unfounded, and the Church exercised prudent caution, seeking to discern the authenticity of Margaret Mary's experiences and the theological richness of the devotion. But even as these discussions unfolded, the Sacred Heart continued to move quietly, touching hearts in unexpected ways. It spread not through force or argument, but through the gentle power of lived witness, the transformation seen in those who practiced it sincerely, the peace that radiated from communities shaped by it, and the deep healing it brought to individuals burdened by guilt or sorrow. Meanwhile, the convent at Paray-le-Monial became increasingly known as a place of spiritual renewal. Pilgrims began to visit, drawn by the growing reputation of Margaret Mary's holiness and the devotion she had championed. They came seeking comfort, healing, forgiveness, or simply a deeper relationship with God. Some arrived skeptical, unsure of what to expect, but left with a quiet sense of having encountered something sacred. Others came burdened with grief or despair, and found in the devotion a lifeline of hope. The sisters welcomed them with gentle hospitality, sharing the message of the Sacred Heart not through grand speeches, but through the simplicity of their lives. Their prayer, their kindness, their humility, all of it became a silent testimony to the love that had transformed their community from within. As the movement grew, priests and religious began to gather and organize the devotion more formally. They developed prayers, litanies, and acts of consecration. They encouraged families to enthrone the Sacred Heart in their homes, inviting Christ's love to reign at the center of domestic life. Schools, churches, and communities began adopting the devotion, weaving it into their spiritual practices. It spread across France, then into other parts of Europe, carried by missionaries and pilgrims who recognized in it a profound expression of the gospel. Meanwhile, the memory of Margaret Mary continued to deepen in the hearts of those who knew her story. Her humility, her patience, her obedience, all became part of the growing tradition surrounding the Sacred Heart. People spoke of her not only as a visionary, but as a model of holiness, a soul who embodied the very love she sought to share. Over time, stories of her life began to circulate more widely, inspiring countless individuals to embrace a path of deeper devotion. Her name, once spoken only within the quiet halls of the convent, now found its way into sermons, writings, and conversations among the faithful. Still, the devotion's path was not without obstacles. Periods of resistance arose, moments when war or social upheaval threatened to overshadow spiritual pursuits. But through each challenge, the Sacred Heart endured, drawing strength from the very love that inspired it. And as the decades passed, the devotion grew so deeply rooted in the life of the Church that it became impossible to imagine Catholic spirituality without it. In time, the Church initiated the careful process of examining Margaret Mary's life and visions. Her writings were studied, testimonies collected, and the fruits of the devotion evaluated. What emerged was a portrait of authenticity, a woman whose holiness could not be dismissed, whose fidelity was undeniable, and whose mission aligned perfectly with the deepest truths of the faith. This discernment would take years to unfold, but its foundation was already being laid through the quiet witness of those whose lives had been transformed by the Sacred Heart. Thus, the legacy of Margaret Mary Alacoque continued to grow, not through noise or spectacle, but through the steady, enduring flame of love that she had helped ignite. Her story, once hidden, was beginning to shine across the world, touching hearts and drawing souls closer to the heart of Christ. And though she had passed from this earth, the devotion she carried in silence was becoming a river of grace flowing outward, shaping generations of faith. The years continued to unfold gently after Margaret Mary's passing, and though she no longer walked the halls of Paray-le-Monial, her presence seemed to linger in ways the sisters could neither fully describe nor rationalize. It was not a matter of visions or supernatural signs, but of a spiritual warmth, a soft clarity that permeated the convent. Her absence became, paradoxically, another form of presence, quieter, deeper, like the glow that remains long after a candle is burned down to its final flame. The devotion to the Sacred Heart, once a source of tension, now became the unifying thread that stitched together the daily rhythm of community life. The sisters found comfort in the prayers she had once offered alone. They embraced the spirit of reparation she had carried in silence. And increasingly, they shared the message of divine love with those who came seeking counsel. In this gentle expansion, the convent became a wellspring of spiritual renewal, slowly transforming into the beating center of a movement that had begun with a single, often misunderstood nun. As interest in the Sacred Heart spread through France, the devotion found itself in a delicate position. While many embraced it with enthusiasm, others viewed it with skepticism, concerned that such intimate expressions of divine love might encourage emotional excess or detract from established forms of worship. The Church, cautious and deliberate as always, observed the growing practice with patience. The theology of Christ's love was ancient, rooted in Scripture and tradition. Yet the specific expressions requested through Margaret Mary's visions, acts of reparation, the Feast of the Sacred Heart, and the emblem of the heart itself, required careful consideration. In this period of discernment, the testimonies of the Visitation sisters played a vital role. Their descriptions of Margaret Mary's humility, her unwavering obedience, and her sincere love for Christ painted a portrait that could not easily be dismissed. Her writings, too, offered a window into the purity of her interior life. They were simple, devoid of self-promotion, and filled with a tender longing for the salvation of souls. These qualities strengthened the growing belief that the devotion was not born of personal imagination, but of genuine divine inspiration. Meanwhile, the world outside the cloister was undergoing rapid and often tumultuous change. Wars erupted, leaving deep emotional and spiritual wounds in their wake. Famine swept through regions, driving people to desperate acts of survival. Political structures shifted, creating uncertainty and unrest. In this climate of instability, the devotion to the Sacred Heart became, for many, a source of profound consolation. It was not merely a set of prayers, but a refuge, a reminder that beneath the turmoil of human history lay the steady pulse of divine love. People clung to the image of Christ's heart, a heart wounded, yet burning with mercy, and found comfort in its tenderness. Families placed the image in their homes as a sign of protection. Soldiers carried it into battle as a source of courage. Mothers prayed before it for their children's safety. Priests encouraged their parishioners to see in the Sacred Heart the remedy for fear, sorrow, and spiritual dryness. It was during these years that the devotion received a powerful advocate in the person of Pope Clement V, who, in 1765, approved the Feast of the Sacred Heart for certain dioceses and religious orders. This recognition marked a significant turning point, granting official legitimacy to the devotion that had once been met with hesitation. Although the feast was still limited in scope, its approval signaled the Church's willingness to embrace the spiritual treasure entrusted to Margaret Mary. It was as though the faint glow she had kindled during her earthly life had finally grown bright enough to be acknowledged by the highest authority in the Church. The devotion now stood at the threshold of a new era, ready to spread with greater freedom and confidence. This momentum continued into the 19th century, when the world found itself grappling with new forms of suffering. Industrialization, while bringing progress, also introduced harsh working conditions, loneliness, and moral challenges. Revolutions erupted, leaving societies fractured and wounded. The need for healing grew more urgent than ever, and in this atmosphere, the Sacred Heart devotion blossomed anew. Missionaries carried it to distant lands, sharing its message with cultures far removed from the quiet French convent where it had begun. Churches dedicated to the Sacred Heart appeared across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The image of Christ's heart, crowned with thorns, aflame with love, became a symbol recognized and cherished by millions. It spoke to the universal longing for compassion, for understanding, for a love that could mend even the deepest wounds. In 1856, the devotion reached a monumental milestone when Pope Pius IX extended the Feast of the Sacred Heart to the entire Catholic Church. This decision, made after nearly 2 centuries of discernment, affirmed the global significance of the devotion. Margaret Mary's mission, once hidden behind the walls of a small convent, had now become a central heartbeat of Catholic spirituality. The Church, in her wisdom, recognized that the Sacred Heart offered not merely comfort, but a profound theological truth: that God's love is personal, vulnerable, and intimately engaged in the struggles of humanity. Through this devotion, countless souls were invited to contemplate the depths of divine mercy, to see in Christ's heart the very essence of the gospel. But what of Margaret Mary herself during this time of flourishing? Her name began to surface more frequently in discussions surrounding the origin of the devotion. Stories of her humility and suffering were retold in religious communities. Her writings were printed and distributed, offering guidance to those seeking a deeper understanding of Christ's love. The Church, recognizing the impact of her mission, initiated the early stages of investigating her sanctity. Witnesses were interviewed, documents gathered, and testimonies examined. Those who had known her spoke of her unwavering obedience, her gentle spirit, and her extraordinary charity. They described how she never sought attention, how she rarely spoke of her visions unless required to do so, and how she endured misunderstandings with grace. These accounts revealed a woman whose holiness was not anchored in mystical experiences alone, but in the way she lived her daily life, with patience, humility, and deep faith. As the devotion continued to grow, so too did the Church's appreciation for Margaret Mary's role as its messenger. People began turning to her in prayer, seeking her intercession for healing, guidance, or spiritual renewal. Her life became a model for those striving to cultivate humility and surrender. Even those who never experienced mystical visions found in her an example of how to respond to God's call, even when that call leads into misunderstanding or solitude. Her legacy was teaching the Church that holiness is often hidden, forged in silence, and revealed only in God's time. The 19th century also brought a surge of artistic and architectural tributes dedicated to the Sacred Heart. Perhaps the most famous of these was the Basilica of the Sacré-Cœur in Paris, a towering white monument perched atop Montmartre, its domes gleaming over the city like a beacon of hope. Built as an act of national reparation after years of turmoil, the basilica embodied the devotion's deep connection to healing and restoration. The structure itself, rising above the urban landscape, seemed to echo the message of the heart it honored, that love stands firm above the chaos of human history, offering refuge to all who seek it. Pilgrims traveled to the basilica from across the world, carrying their burdens, hopes, and prayers. And in the quiet of its chapels, many spoke of feeling a profound peace, the same peace that had filled the little room in Paray-le-Monial, where Margaret Mary had once prayed in silence. As the devotion reached new heights, so did the recognition of the woman chosen to bear its message. In 1864, Margaret Mary was declared venerable by the Church, a formal acknowledgement of her heroic virtue. This marked the beginning of a long journey toward canonization. Miracles attributed to her intercession began to be documented and examined. These were not grand or spectacle-driven events, but simple, profound healings that reflected the quiet nature of her mission. Families prayed for her help in times of illness or crisis, and many spoke of receiving comfort or unexpected grace. The Church approached these claims with careful scrutiny, honoring both the devotion's significance and the need for sound discernment. By the late 19th century, Margaret Mary's name had become inseparable from the Sacred Heart. Her life story inspired new movements within the Church, including the apostleship of prayer and the enthronement of the Sacred Heart in homes. Practices that continue to shape Catholic spirituality today. Her legacy was no longer confined to history. It had become a living presence, woven into the daily prayer of millions. And as the 20th century approached, the Church prepared to take the final steps in recognizing publicly what many already believed in their hearts: that Margaret Mary Alacoque was a saint, chosen by God to bring healing love to a world in desperate need. Her journey, once marked by misunderstanding and obscurity, was now becoming a radiant testament to the transformative power of God's love. And still, the devotion continued to grow, carrying her story forward like a gentle flame, illuminating the path of faith for generations to come. As the devotion flourished across continents and entered more deeply into the heart of Catholic spirituality, the memory of Margaret Mary continued to expand in quiet, steady waves, touching places far beyond anything she could have imagined during her hidden life in Paray-le-Monial. Her story began to be studied not only by theologians, but by ordinary believers who found in her a companion for their own struggles, someone who understood loneliness, misunderstanding, frailty, and the mysterious demands of God's call. The more the world discovered about her life, the more people recognized the profound humility that had shaped her mission. She had never sought recognition, never attempted to impose her visions on others, and never used her mystical experiences as a source of power or privilege. Instead, she had embraced the suffering that came with them, allowing herself to be shaped by the very love she was asked to proclaim. This humility became one of the clearest signs of her holiness, and it formed the foundation upon which her canonization process steadily advanced. In the decades that followed her being declared venerable, the devotion to the Sacred Heart became not merely a spiritual practice, but a cultural force. In Catholic homes throughout Europe and beyond, images of the Sacred Heart were enthroned as visible reminders of Christ's reigning love. Families gathered daily to pray before these images, consecrating their joys, sorrows, and hopes to the heart of Jesus. Entire communities participated in monthly First Friday devotions, offering reparation for sins and seeking renewal of faith. Schools and parishes adopted the Sacred Heart as their patron, teaching children not only the prayers associated with the devotion, but the spirit of compassion and tenderness that lay beneath it. Religious orders incorporated the devotion into their daily routines, seeing in the heart of Christ the model for their apostolic missions. This widespread embrace reflected the universality of the devotion. It was not confined to one culture, language, or theological background. Rather, it spoke to something profoundly human, a longing for unconditional love, for mercy, for healing. As this global movement matured, the Church continued its careful examination of Margaret Mary's life and the fruits of her mission. Her writings were translated into multiple languages and studied by spiritual directors, theologians, and ordinary faithful alike. They found in her words a wisdom that was both simple and profound, a voice that echoed not her own brilliance, but the gentle cadence of divine love speaking through her. Through her descriptions of the Sacred Heart, readers began to understand not simply an image of Christ, but the very nature of his love, a love that suffers, forgives, and perseveres. Her writings revealed the depth of her union with Christ and the sincerity of her desire to console him. And yet, they also revealed her humanity, her doubts, her fears, her struggles with illness and misunderstanding. This blend of mystical depth and human vulnerability made her a relatable and deeply compelling figure for countless people. She demonstrated that holiness was not about achieving perfection through one's own strength, but about surrendering fully to the love of God, even when that love leads into difficult and hidden paths. As devotion to the Sacred Heart deepened, miracles attributed to Margaret Mary's intercession began to emerge with increasing frequency. These accounts came from people in various corners of the world, families who prayed for healing, religious communities facing trials, individuals who sought spiritual strength in times of crisis. Some miracles involved dramatic physical healings. Others spoke of interior conversions that transformed lives from within. The Church, as always, approached these claims with thorough scrutiny, examining each carefully before recognizing its authenticity. Yet even the miracles that did not meet the strict criteria for official recognition contributed to the growing sense among the faithful that Margaret Mary was a powerful intercessor in heaven. Her spiritual motherhood, once hidden within the walls of her convent, now reached out gently toward souls around the world. By the time the 20th century dawned, the devotion had become firmly established in Catholic life. The newly emerging challenges of the modern world, world wars, rapid industrialization, political upheavals, and pervasive social change, left many feeling spiritually uprooted. Yet, amid the uncertainty, the image of the Sacred Heart remained a steady and comforting reminder that divine love was unchanging. During times of war, soldiers carried medals of the Sacred Heart with them into battle, believing that Christ's love would protect them in moments of danger. Families devastated by loss found solace in the idea that Christ, through his wounded heart, understood human suffering intimately. Many turned to the Sacred Heart when the world felt fractured, seeing in it a symbol of unity, forgiveness, and peace. And as people prayed for healing and reconciliation, they often invoked the intercession of Margaret Mary, whose life embodied exactly those virtues. It was in this atmosphere of global need and deepening devotion that the Church decided to take the next step in acknowledging Margaret Mary's place in its spiritual heritage. In 1920, Pope Benedict XV canonized her, declaring her Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque. The ceremony, held in Rome, was attended by pilgrims from around the world who had been touched by the devotion she had helped bring into the light. For many, her canonization represented not only the recognition of her personal holiness, but the culmination of a centuries-long journey in which the Sacred Heart devotion had moved from obscurity to the very heart of Catholic spirituality. The Church proclaimed her a model of humility, obedience, and love. A saint whose life testified to the quiet power of surrender to God. Her canonization did not diminish the devotion, but seemed instead to infuse it with renewed energy. Cathedrals, parishes, schools, and religious communities dedicated to the Sacred Heart began to invoke her as their patroness. Her feast day, celebrated on October 16th, became a moment for the faithful to reflect not only on her mystical experiences, but on her remarkable capacity for suffering and love. Her story was retold in countless homilies, books, and catechetical materials, helping new generations understand the spiritual treasure she had received. Saints, theologians, and popes alike spoke of her with affection and respect, acknowledging the pivotal role she played in shaping modern devotion to the love of Christ. Throughout the 20th century, the Sacred Heart continued to be a powerful source of spiritual renewal. In times of social unrest, it served as a reminder of Christ's steadfast compassion. In moments of personal sorrow, it offered comfort. In the face of growing secularism, it provided an anchor. Many Catholics embraced consecration to the Sacred Heart as a way of rooting their lives in mercy and self-giving love. Parishes held annual processions, families renewed their consecrations, and religious orders deepened their understanding of the devotion's theological richness. At the heart of all this spiritual activity, Margaret Mary remained present, a quiet guide pointing always toward Christ. And yet, even as her public recognition increased, the essence of her mission remained unchanged. She had never been called to grand gestures or dramatic proclamations. Her path had been one of silence, suffering, obedience, and love. This, perhaps, was what resonated most deeply with the faithful in the tumultuous modern era. Her life served as a gentle reminder that holiness doesn't depend on extraordinary abilities or public acclaim, but on fidelity to God in the small, often hidden moments of daily life. Her witness suggested that the greatest transformations often begin in silence, that the most enduring movements of the Spirit unfold slowly, and that the depth of divine love is revealed most clearly to those who have the courage to surrender fully to it. As the century progressed and the devotion spread to every corner of the world, the figure of Saint Margaret Mary became increasingly intertwined with the Sacred Heart itself. Her relics were venerated, her convent became a pilgrimage site, and her name was spoken with gratitude by people whose lives had been touched by the heart of Christ. Her story, once confined to the quiet walls of Paray-le-Monial, had now become part of the universal story of the Church, an enduring testament to the power of hidden holiness, patient suffering, and unwavering love. In the decades that followed her canonization, the figure of Saint Margaret Mary seemed to move ever more gently into the spiritual bloodstream of the Church, not as a distant saint enthroned in the echoes of history, but as a living presence whose influence continued to shape hearts, parishes, families, and entire cultures. Devotion to the Sacred Heart had already become widespread by the early 20th century, but the era that followed, marked by global conflict, ideological upheaval, and rapid social transformation, revealed just how deeply the message entrusted to her resonated with the human condition. The heart of Jesus, burning with love yet wounded by sorrow, became a symbol that spoke to nations devastated by war and individuals suffering in silence. It seemed to offer a bridge between the fragility of the human experience and the infinite compassion of God. And behind this movement, quiet and steadfast, stood the memory of the Visitation nun, whose hidden life had helped make it possible. With the outbreak of the First World War, devotion to the Sacred Heart took on new layers of meaning. Soldiers carried small images of the heart in their pockets, believing it would protect them on the battlefield. Mothers placed Sacred Heart badges inside the uniforms of their sons, whispering prayers that Christ's love would shelter them amid the chaos of battle. Chaplains encouraged devotion to strengthen soldiers' courage and remind them of the merciful presence of God, even in the darkest trenches. In the aftermath of the war, as nations grappled with grief and the massive loss of life, many found comfort in the idea of a heart that understood suffering intimately. The devotion became a means of processing trauma, of finding solace in divine companionship, and of rebuilding trust in the goodness of God. The interwar years saw renewed interest in the teachings of Margaret Mary, as spiritual leaders sought to help the faithful navigate the confusion of rapid modernization. Her emphasis on reparation, on offering one's own sorrows, difficulties, and sacrifices for the healing of a wounded world, spoke powerfully to people faced with economic hardship and increasing moral uncertainty. The Sacred Heart became a symbol not only of consolation, but of hope, reminding believers that divine love could bring meaning out of suffering and light out of darkness. During this period, schools, hospitals, and charitable organizations founded under the patronage of the Sacred Heart began to flourish, embodying in concrete ways the compassion that Christ had revealed to Margaret Mary. These institutions became expressions of the devotion's core message, that love heals, love restores, and love endures. When the Second World War erupted, the Sacred Heart once again emerged as a spiritual refuge. Entire cities consecrated themselves to the heart of Jesus, asking for protection from violence and destruction. Families gathered nightly before the image of the Sacred Heart to pray for loved ones and for peace. In occupied nations, devotion to the Sacred Heart became a quiet form of resistance, a declaration that no earthly power could extinguish the light of divine love. Priests and religious distributed Sacred Heart medals to prisoners, refugees, and the wounded, offering them a tangible reminder of God's presence in their suffering. Missionaries continued to spread the devotion even in war zones, carrying with them the message that Christ's heart remained open to all, especially those most in need. In these years, the quiet strength of Margaret Mary's message shone with new relevance, speaking to a world once again desperate for mercy and healing. After the war, the Church experienced a time of renewal, and devotion to the Sacred Heart became more deeply embedded in its pastoral mission. Popes spoke passionately about the significance of the Sacred Heart in restoring unity, promoting peace, and fostering compassion in a fractured world. Pope Pius XII, in particular, gave the devotion renewed theological depth with his encyclical Horietis Aquas in 1956, affirming the centrality of the Sacred Heart in Catholic life and praising Margaret Mary as the chosen instrument of Christ's love. In this document, the Church proclaimed that the Sacred Heart was not merely a devotional image, but a profound expression of the entire mystery of Christ, his humanity, divinity, love, and sacrifice. This recognition deepened the devotion's meaning for millions of believers and placed Margaret Mary's mission firmly at the center of Catholic spirituality. In these years of spiritual growth, the Visitation convent at Paray-le-Monial became a major pilgrimage site. Pilgrims traveled long distances to pray in the chapel where Margaret Mary had received her visions, seeking the same peace and consolation she had found. They knelt before the tabernacle that had witnessed her tears and her ecstasies, feeling the quiet echo of her presence. Many described experiencing a sense of profound calm, as though the walls themselves held the memory of her intimate union with Christ. The Sisters of the Visitation welcomed visitors with the same gentle hospitality that had once characterized their community's transformation under Margaret Mary's influence. They shared her story with reverence, not as a tale of dramatic miracles, but as the unfolding of a soul shaped by love, humility, and unwavering obedience to God's will. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, devotion to the Sacred Heart continued to flourish across continents. In Latin America, it became a powerful symbol of hope amid poverty and oppression. In the Philippines, families embraced the devotion as a source of unity and strength. In Africa, missionaries introduced the Sacred Heart as a healing presence amid violence and tribal conflict. In Europe, the devotion remained a beloved part of Catholic life, even as secularism grew. Parishes held regular holy hours of adoration, celebrated First Friday Masses, and incorporated consecration to the Sacred Heart into family traditions. Countless individuals found in the devotion a source of renewal during personal crises, disasters, and times of spiritual dryness. Through all these experiences, the message entrusted to Margaret Mary continued to echo. Christ's heart beats with unwavering love for every soul, offering refuge, healing, and peace. Yet even as devotion flourished, the figure of Margaret Mary remained surprisingly gentle and unassuming in the minds of the faithful. She did not overshadow the Sacred Heart. Rather, she quietly guided people toward it, much as she had done during her earthly life. Her story was not one of public triumph or dramatic interventions, but of hidden fidelity. She showed the world that profound transformation often begins in silence, in small acts of love, in patient endurance of suffering. Her legacy became a testament to the idea that saints need not be dazzling figures to shape the Church. Some change the world simply by being faithful to the whispers of God in the depths of their heart. As the century came to a close, the message of the Sacred Heart gained fresh relevance amid the anxieties of modern life. Increasingly, people struggled with feelings of isolation, stress, and spiritual hunger. Many felt disconnected from tradition, from community, even from their own sense of purpose. In this climate of fragmentation, the image of the Sacred Heart, warm, tender, and endlessly open, offered a point of return. It reminded people that they were loved, that they were never alone, that their wounds could be healed in the embrace of divine compassion. Spiritual retreats centered on the Sacred Heart multiplied, and lay movements dedicated to spreading its message emerged with renewed vigor. Across the world, Catholics celebrated the Feast of the Sacred Heart with heartfelt devotion, uniting millions in a single prayer of love and reparation. Through all this, the spirit of Saint Margaret Mary continued to quietly accompany the faithful. Her example remained a guiding light for those who felt unseen, misunderstood, or burdened by suffering. She reminded them that God often chooses the humble, the quiet, the fragile, to carry His most important messages. And she reminded the Church that the deepest truths of faith are often revealed not in grand public acts, but in hidden acts of love, silently offered for the salvation of the world. Thus, as the 20th century ended and the 21st began, the devotion born from her fidelity continued to flow like a river through the Church, soft, steady, healing, drawing countless souls into the heart that had captivated her own. And still, the question lingered gently in the background. How would the message of the Sacred Heart, entrusted to a hidden nun centuries earlier, continue to shape a world that was changing faster than ever before? As the 21st century unfolded, with its rapid technologies, shifting identities, and global uncertainties, the devotion to the Sacred Heart remained a steady, luminous thread woven quietly through the life of the Church, a thread that seemed, in many ways, more necessary than ever. The world was moving at a relentless pace, leaving many people feeling disoriented and spiritually adrift. Societal divisions widened. Loneliness took on new and unexpected forms, even in a world more connected than any before it. Yet, amid these profound changes, the message entrusted to Saint Margaret Mary, simple, tender, and deeply human, continued to call hearts back to the one who longs for every soul with a love both infinite and intimate. It was remarkable to see how a devotion born in the intimate silence of a small 17th century convent could speak so clearly to the complicated interior world of modern humanity. But in this paradox lay the essence of the Sacred Heart, a love that transcends time, culture, and circumstance, because it responds to the most universal longing of all, the desire to be loved without condition. In these modern decades, the Sacred Heart found renewed strength in places where suffering weighed heavily on communities. In regions marked by poverty, violence, or instability, missionaries and local clergy continued to present the heart of Jesus as a refuge for those burdened by fear or despair. The message that Christ's love burns even in the darkest circumstances offered comfort to families displaced by conflict, to children growing up amid uncertainty, and to those who wondered whether God still remembered them. In hospitals and shelters, chaplains brought images of the Sacred Heart to patients and the dying, whispering that they were not alone, that Christ understood every pain and carried every sorrow, and countless individuals, young and old, rediscovered the tenderness of this devotion through prayer groups, retreats, and spiritual direction. Many described feeling as though they had encountered not a distant God, but a friend whose heart beat gently beside their own. At the same time, new movements within the Church sought to articulate the message of the Sacred Heart in ways that resonated with contemporary spiritual seekers. Writers and theologians reflected on the symbolism of the heart, its fire, its wounds, its enduring love, and connected these images to modern questions about identity, healing, and belonging. They emphasized that the Sacred Heart is not merely a devotional emblem, but a profound theological truth. That God reveals Himself most fully through a heart that suffers and loves with equal depth. Spiritual directors encouraged those struggling with anxiety or interior conflict to meditate on the Sacred Heart, guiding them to place their fears within the warmth of Christ's wounded love. And young adults, navigating the pressures of a fragmented world, found solace in consecrating their lives to the heart that promised peace amid uncertainty. As this renewal unfolded, the figure of Saint Margaret Mary emerged with fresh relevance. Scholars revisited her writings, discovering in them not only mystical depth, but a remarkably modern sensitivity to the interior struggles of the human soul. She wrote of fear, of self-doubt, of longing, of the delicate balance between surrender and perseverance, all experiences familiar to people today. Her voice, though centuries old, resonated with surprising clarity in a world hungry for authenticity. Many found comfort in the fact that she too had known misunderstanding, loneliness, and frailty. Yet through all of it, she had remained steadfast, trusting the gentle whisper of God in her heart. Her example encouraged countless believers who felt overwhelmed by their own fragility, reminding them that holiness is not perfection, but fidelity to God's love in the midst of weakness. Pilgrimages to Paray-le-Monial increased during these years, drawing people from every corner of the world. Travelers arrived seeking peace, healing, or direction. When they knelt in the chapel, where Margaret Mary had once prayed in obscurity, many felt a sense of familiarity, as though her quiet faith reached across time to reassure them. The silence of the place seemed saturated with her presence, with the hours she had spent in prayer, with the tears she had offered in union with Christ, with the quiet endurance that had shaped her soul. Some pilgrims left with renewed hope, others with a sense of spiritual clarity they had sought for years. The convent, still home to the Visitation sisters, continued Margaret Mary's legacy of gentle hospitality and contemplative prayer, offering the world a place where hearts could rest, even briefly, within the embrace of the Sacred Heart. Meanwhile, the Church continued to draw from the richness of Margaret Mary's mission in its reflections on mercy, compassion, and the centrality of Christ's love. Popes throughout the 21st century spoke with growing frequency about the importance of returning to the heart of Jesus as the center of Christian life. They emphasized that in a world marked by noise, conflict, and distraction, the heart of Christ offered a sanctuary of peace and tenderness, capable of healing the deepest wounds. Many referenced Margaret Mary directly, praising her courage, her trust, and her willingness to be shaped by God's love even when it cost her everything. Her story became part of a broader call to rediscover the simplicity of the gospel, to ground faith not in fear or rigid structures, but in the warmth of divine charity. In families, the devotion experienced a gentle revival as parents sought to anchor their homes in love during uncertain times. Many enthroned the Sacred Heart in their living rooms, kitchens, or bedrooms, renewing an old tradition with renewed meaning. They prayed together as families, asking Christ to reign over their relationships, guide their decisions, and strengthen them in compassion. Parents taught their children to pray short aspirations to the Sacred Heart, encouraging them to turn to Jesus whenever they felt afraid or overwhelmed. These small acts of devotion, repeated quietly over time, shaped countless hearts with the same tenderness that had shaped Margaret Mary's own. At the same time, the devotion found a new voice among those working for social justice. They recognized that the Sacred Heart, far from being a merely sentimental symbol, expressed Christ's profound solidarity with the suffering of the world. He whose heart was pierced understood the wounds inflicted by injustice, violence, and isolation. To meditate on his heart, they believed, was to be drawn toward compassionate action, to see the suffering Christ in the poor, the marginalized, the forgotten. And in this recognition, the message of the Sacred Heart revealed once again its timeless relevance. Love cannot remain confined to prayer alone. It must flow outward, healing the wounds of the world. Through all these developments, Saint Margaret Mary's voice remained as soft and steady as ever, guiding believers gently toward the heart of Jesus. Her life, examined more closely in this modern era, offered a profound lesson in the power of hidden faithfulness. She had never sought to lead movements or inspire revolutions. She had simply responded to God's call, step by small step, trusting that He would bring forth fruit from her obedience. And He had, in ways she could never have foreseen. Her story became a quiet invitation to the modern world, to trust in the slow, gentle unfolding of grace, to allow divine love to transform even the most ordinary moments, and to believe that God's greatest works are often hidden in the depths of human vulnerability. As the world continued to evolve, sometimes peacefully, sometimes turbulently, the devotion to the Sacred Heart flowed steadily forward, a river of mercy moving through every generation. And in its current, the memory of Saint Margaret Mary continued to shine like a soft, enduring light. Her mission was not merely a historical event. It was a living grace, ever renewed, ever relevant, ever calling humanity back to the warmth of a heart that never ceases to love. Thus, even centuries after her death, the quiet nun of Paray-le-Monial remained a spiritual companion to millions. A gentle guide, whispering the same truth she had learned in the depths of suffering, that the heart of Jesus is a refuge without end, a place where every soul can find peace, healing, and the tender embrace of divine love. As the devotion continued flowing steadily into the early decades of the 21st century, forming its gentle patterns among families, parishes, religious communities, and private hearts yearning for God, the quiet legacy of Saint Margaret Mary found itself woven even more deeply into the spiritual needs of a world that had grown strangely restless. If earlier centuries had grappled with external conflicts, wars, famines, political revolutions, these newer decades presented a different kind of battle, one waged silently within the human heart. Depression, anxiety, and a pervasive sense of isolation seemed to spread across societies, even those outwardly prosperous. Life became faster, noisier, more fragmented. The digital world connected people across continents in seconds, yet left many feeling unseen and unknown. In the midst of this new landscape of interior tension, the devotion to the Sacred Heart appeared with a renewed kind of luminosity, like an old lantern rediscovered in a darkened attic, its flame steady, its message unchanging, its warmth more needed than ever. In many ways, the modern hunger for authentic love mirrored the spiritual poverty that had once shaped Margaret Mary's own journey. She had longed not merely for doctrinal clarity or religious ritual, but for a personal relationship with Christ, a relationship rooted in tenderness, mutual fidelity, and the mystery of divine compassion. And now, centuries later, countless souls found themselves longing for that same intimacy. A God who saw them, who understood the weight they carried, who held them gently when the world felt overwhelming. In retreats centered on the Sacred Heart, spiritual directors observed a striking pattern. Participants, whether young students, exhausted parents, retirees grappling with loneliness, or professionals burned out from relentless demands, spoke less about doctrinal concerns and more about a yearning to be loved without condition. They longed for a God whose heart was near to their own. They longed, without fully realizing it, for exactly what had been revealed to Margaret Mary. This was perhaps why her writings experienced a quiet resurgence. Not only theologians but ordinary Catholics began rediscovering her letters, her reflections, and her descriptions of the Sacred Heart. They found in her words an unexpected clarity, an understanding of suffering, loneliness, and inner contradiction that felt strikingly modern. Her descriptions of Christ's love, so gentle yet so consuming, resonated with those trying to navigate broken relationships, chronic stress, or feelings of inadequacy. They discovered that this nun from the 17th century had somehow articulated the very ache they carried, and in her unwavering trust they found courage. People who had grown weary of harsh self-criticism found themselves embracing the idea that Christ's heart offered not condemnation, but tender mercy. Those who struggled to forgive found strength in his wounded heart, which forgave even while bleeding. Those who feared their prayers were heard by no one discovered in the Sacred Heart, the promise that no cry is ever lost. As Margaret Mary's voice reached new ears, parishes and religious communities began incorporating her insights into pastoral ministry. Many churches held holy hours specifically dedicated to healing through the Sacred Heart, inviting parishioners to bring not only their sins, but their wounds. These gatherings were marked by a quiet stillness, broken only by soft hymns and whispered prayers. People knelt in the dim glow of candlelight, letting tears fall freely as they placed their burdens before Christ. Confessors noticed a gentle transformation in those who embraced the devotion. Hearts softened, relationships mended, despair lifted, patience renewed. Married couples consecrated their homes to the Sacred Heart, praying for harmony amid the pressures that strained their family life. Parents turned to the Sacred Heart when their children drifted away from faith, trusting that divine love would continue to pursue them with patience far greater than their own. Young people, overwhelmed by uncertainty about the future, found in the Sacred Heart a compass that pointed them toward purpose and peace. In these years, the Church continued to reflect deeply on the theological richness of the devotion. Scholars explored the connection between the Sacred Heart and the Eucharist, noting how the devotion naturally draws souls toward the sacrament in which Christ's heart becomes physically present. They observed that Margaret Mary's revelations emphasized not only consolation, but reparation, a call to respond to love with love, and to offer one's own suffering for the healing of others. This aspect of the devotion gained new significance in a world marked by moral confusion and spiritual fatigue. To make reparation became, for many, an act of solidarity with Christ, a way of standing with him in a world that often ignored or rejected his love. It was not about punishment or harsh asceticism, but about participating in the tenderness of a heart that suffers for all. The influence of the Sacred Heart also became increasingly evident in global humanitarian work. Catholic organizations dedicated to serving the poor, the displaced, and the suffering often invoked the Sacred Heart in their mission statements and spiritual practices. They saw in Christ's heart the model for their service: compassion that reached across boundaries, love that did not discriminate, mercy that endured amid exhaustion. In refugee camps, in war-torn regions, in neighborhoods scarred by violence, missionaries carried images of the Sacred Heart as symbols of hope. They preached not only with words but through actions, feeding the hungry, comforting the dying, advocating for justice. Their work reflected the same truth revealed to Margaret Mary centuries before: that Christ's heart burns with love for every person, especially those most in need. Yet, even as the devotion expanded its reach, the quiet figure of Saint Margaret Mary continued to inspire a spirituality of humility and hiddenness. In an age dominated by visibility and self-presentation, her life offered a powerful counterpoint: the idea that the deepest transformations often happen in silence. Many spiritual writers began holding her up as a model for interior prayer, pointing to her long hours before the Blessed Sacrament as a template for modern contemplation. She taught, without ever intending to teach, that to change the world, one must first allow oneself to be changed by love. And so individuals seeking deeper prayer lives turned to her for guidance. They sat before the Blessed Sacrament in silence, letting the presence of Christ soften their anxieties. They surrendered their own plans, letting grace lead them instead. They discovered that Christ's heart speaks not through noise, but through stillness, through gentle whispers that resonate long after prayer has ended. Missionaries also found in her a model of resilience. Her endurance through misunderstanding and illness reminded them that God's work often unfolds in ways hidden from the eyes of the world. They learned to trust that their small acts of charity and patience, though unseen, were shaping the spiritual landscape in ways they could not fully grasp. This gave them strength to continue their work amid fatigue, disappointment, or lack of recognition. Her relevance grew, too, in circles devoted to mental health. Therapists and counselors who integrated spirituality into their practice found that meditation on the Sacred Heart could be profoundly healing for those suffering from trauma or deep emotional wounds. They noted that the imagery of a heart that is wounded yet loving, pierced yet burning, resonated with individuals who had endured pain but longed to love again. Guided by gentle pastoral care, many discovered that allowing themselves to rest in the heart of Christ helped restore their sense of worth and dignity. And as the devotion continued weaving itself into these countless corners of human experience, Margaret Mary's legacy expanded quietly alongside it, not through grand celebrations, but through the everyday lives transformed by the message she had carried. Her mission, once hidden in the silence of her cell, became a living flame illuminating homes, parishes, and hearts across the world. And she remained, always, what she had been in life, a gentle guide leading souls into the warmth and tenderness of Christ's love. Thus, even as the modern world struggled with its own contradictions, its speed, its loneliness, its longing for purpose, the message of the Sacred Heart continued to offer a gentle antidote, an invitation to rest in divine love, to allow oneself to be healed, and to embrace others with the compassion found in the heart of Christ. And through it all, the soft presence of Saint Margaret Mary lingered like a quiet blessing, reminding the world that the deepest truths are often entrusted to the humblest souls. As the 21st century progressed, and humanity found itself confronted by crises both old and new, the devotion to the Sacred Heart continued to shine quietly as a refuge, a spiritual hearth where weary souls could gather and rediscover the warmth of divine love. Natural disasters, economic instability, and widespread conflict reminded the world of its own fragility. New tensions arose within and outside the Church, testing faith, unity, and resilience. Yet, through it all, the Sacred Heart remained a steady symbol of compassion and fidelity, an image that called each generation to rediscover the gentle fire that had first captivated the heart of Saint Margaret Mary. It was remarkable how her mission, born in silence and suffering, continued to offer healing to a world burdened by wounds she could never have imagined. And now, more than ever, people found themselves turning to her message with a renewed seriousness, seeking in the heart of Christ the stability and tenderness they could not find elsewhere. In this era of profound change, the Church continued to draw deeply from the well of the Sacred Heart, weaving its message into her pastoral care. Parish priests, religious sisters, and lay ministers recognized that modern believers were often overwhelmed not by lack of knowledge, but by exhaustion, emotional, spiritual, and psychological. The Sacred Heart, with its gentle promise of rest for the weary, became a central source of renewal. Homilies focused on Christ's tenderness. Catechists taught children to see Jesus not as a distant king, but as a friend who loved them personally, and retreat directors invited participants to bring their hidden burdens to the heart that longed to console them. The shift was subtle, yet profound. The devotion no longer belonged only to those who practiced traditional forms of piety. It became a universal language of healing that transcended culture, generation, and personal background. In many parts of the world, Eucharistic adoration experienced a quiet resurgence, and with it came a deepening relationship with the Sacred Heart. Young adults, despite living in a digital age that demanded constant motion, found themselves inexplicably drawn to the stillness of the Blessed Sacrament. Kneeling before the Eucharist, they felt the silent pulse of Christ's heart, the same pulse that had spoken to Margaret Mary centuries earlier. Many testified that adoration helped them find clarity in confusion, peace in anxiety, and a sense of belonging in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. These encounters did not erase their struggles, but they offered a place where those struggles could be held gently by divine love. The connection between Eucharistic devotion and the Sacred Heart, emphasized so strongly in Margaret Mary's revelations, now became an anchor for a generation searching for meaning beyond the surface of things. This renewal extended as well into religious orders who looked to Margaret Mary not simply as a visionary, but as a model of contemplative fidelity. Her life of hidden suffering and interior transformation resonated strongly with monks, sisters, and hermits who dedicated themselves to a life of prayer. Many drew inspiration from her perseverance through misunderstanding, recognizing in her a kindred soul who embraced obscurity as a path to profound communion with God. They took her words to heart, that Christ's love is found not in extraordinary displays of holiness, but in humble acts of surrender, offered quietly and faithfully. Through her example, they found renewed courage to live their own vocations without seeking recognition, trusting that God sees what the world overlooks. The influence of the Sacred Heart also expanded within movements devoted to mercy and compassion. Organizations that served the homeless, the abandoned, or the persecuted often adopted the Sacred Heart as their patron, believing that their mission flowed directly from the burning love that Christ revealed to Margaret Mary. Volunteers spoke of experiencing a deeper understanding of the heart of Jesus when encountering the suffering of others, recognizing that each act of kindness was a small participation in the compassion of Christ. This vision of charity, rooted not in obligation but in heartfelt love, transformed the way many Catholics approached social justice, tempering activism with tenderness and grounding service in prayer. Throughout these developments, the figure of Saint Margaret Mary seemed to grow even more luminous in the spiritual imagination of the Church. Though her name did not dominate theological debates or public discourse, her presence was felt quietly and consistently, like the gentle rhythm of a heartbeat beneath the larger movements of history. Scholars explored her writings with renewed attention, discovering layers of mystical insight that had been overlooked. They found in her descriptions of the Sacred Heart a theology not merely of consolation, but of transformation, a call to let one's life become a reflection of divine love in every thought, decision, and relationship. Her understanding of reparation, once misunderstood as stern or burdensome, was now recognized as a profound invitation to participate in the healing of a wounded world. It was not a call to self-punishment, but to self-giving, not an invitation to despair, but to love more fully. Her influence reached into the lives of those who suffered deeply, especially individuals battling chronic illness, emotional pain, or grief. Many of them found solace in her steadfast endurance, her willingness to trust God even when isolated or afraid. They prayed to her for strength, asking her to help them unite their own suffering with the heart of Christ. Her life reminded them that God does great things through fragile instruments, that holiness is possible even in weakness, and that suffering, when offered with love, becomes a powerful prayer. Letters and testimonies poured into the Visitation convent where she had lived, describing the many ways she had become a companion on the difficult road of suffering. People who felt invisible or forgotten found comfort in knowing that she, too, had walked a path of obscurity and emerged radiant with grace. Her story also offered particular consolation to those who felt misunderstood by others or burdened by spiritual confusion. Margaret Mary had endured both: misinterpretation from her sisters, internal darkness of spirit, and the heavy responsibility of carrying a message few believed at first. In her perseverance, they found encouragement to trust God's timing, even when clarity seemed elusive. Her life demonstrated that faith is not the absence of struggle, but the willingness to walk forward despite it, anchored in the belief that divine love accompanies every step. Throughout the Catholic world, churches dedicated to the Sacred Heart continued to flourish, standing as visible reminders of the love that had guided Margaret Mary's life. These churches, whether towering cathedrals or humble chapels, became places of refuge where people sought healing, confessed their sins, and renewed their hope. Pilgrims traveled to Paray-le-Monial in even greater numbers, seeking the peace that seemed to rest upon the grounds where she had lived and prayed. Some came with heavy hearts, others with quiet gratitude. All came with the longing to feel close to the heart that had shaped her story. And through all these movements, large and small, public and private, her influence flowed like a gentle river. She had never sought to be known, yet her life touched millions. She had never tried to form a movement, yet a global devotion blossomed from her fidelity. She had never aimed to change the world, yet her hidden offering transformed the spiritual life of the Church. As the century moved forward, the question arose once again, softly, naturally, almost reverently. What deeper graces might still unfold through the devotion she helped reveal? What new chapters might Christ be writing in the hearts of believers, families, and communities who continue to draw near to his heart? And how might Saint Margaret Mary, ever gentle and steady, continue guiding the world toward a love that never ends? In the quiet movement of years that continued to pass, the devotion to the Sacred Heart, like a river that grows deeper with time, gathering the stories and longings of countless souls, flowed steadily into the fabric of the universal Church. And beneath that movement remained, unmistakably, the soft imprint of Saint Margaret Mary, whose hidden fidelity had set this river in motion centuries before. As the world pressed further into an age marked by rapid change, moral uncertainty, and a growing sense of spiritual dislocation, her message did not fade. Instead, it seemed to rise ever more gently to the surface, offering a stable truth amid the shifting tides of human experience. Her life, once confined to the cloister walls of Paray-le-Monial, continued to radiate outward, shaping not only private devotion, but the very heartbeat of Catholic spirituality. One of the most striking developments in these later years was the Church's renewed recognition of the Sacred Heart as a remedy for the woundedness of modern humanity. Pastors and spiritual directors increasingly turned to the language of the heart when ministering to people burdened by shame, fear, or deep emotional pain. They found that many believers, perhaps without the theological vocabulary to articulate it, were searching for a God who understood not only their sins, but their fragility. In the Sacred Heart, they found exactly this, a God whose love was not distant or abstract, but intimately attuned to the human condition. And in Margaret Mary, they found a companion who embodied this same tenderness, one who had herself felt fear, confusion, and solitude, yet had surrendered these experiences into the warmth of Christ's love. In theological discussions and spiritual writings, the Sacred Heart was often described as the medicine of our age, a phrase that resonated deeply in a world where suffering frequently manifested not only in physical wounds, but in interior fractures. Psychologists and pastoral counselors began to observe how meditation on the Sacred Heart could assist individuals struggling with loneliness, identity crises, or the deep ache of unhealed memories. They noted how the image of a wounded heart that continued to burn with love offered a healing counterpoint to the fear of rejection that often plagued the modern soul. Many described the devotion not as an escape from suffering, but as a safe place where suffering could be brought into the light, held, and transformed. It was precisely what Margaret Mary had lived in her own life, the mysterious exchange where a soul gives its wounds to Christ, and Christ fills those wounds with his love. The Visitation convent at Paray-le-Monial, once a hidden corner of Burgundy, known only to a handful of pilgrims, became increasingly recognized as a place of spiritual renewal for the Church. Clergy from around the world visited to rest, reflect, and reconnect with the tenderness of Christ. Religious communities held retreats there, seeking to rediscover the simplicity of their founding charisms. Laypeople, inspired by Margaret Mary's story, traveled with burdens that they rarely spoke aloud. Fears about their families, guilt over past mistakes, grief too heavy to carry alone. Many reported that, within the quiet of the chapel where she had once prayed, they sensed a peace that did not come from their own efforts but from the heart that had called her. A growing number of pilgrims remarked that they felt seen, as if the silence of the place had a way of making room for God's gaze to meet their own. The Sisters of the Visitation, continuing Margaret Mary's legacy of gentleness, welcomed each visitor with the same quiet charity that had once softened the hearts of those who lived with her. The devotion also found new life within the movements of evangelization that characterized the contemporary Church. Missionaries, catechists, and lay evangelists embraced the Sacred Heart as a bridge between the gospel and the deepest human desires. They used its imagery to speak about God's mercy in prisons, hospitals, schools, and rural villages. In countries where Christianity was newly planted or newly revived, the Sacred Heart often became one of the first devotions to flourish, perhaps because it required no elaborate explanation. A heart burning with love, wounded yet open. That image spoke across cultures, languages, and histories. Converts found in it a simple yet profound introduction to the mystery of Christ, and those returning to the faith after years of absence discovered in the Sacred Heart a welcome that asked for nothing but openness. Saint Margaret Mary's influence, though subtle, could be traced in these movements. Her writings were frequently quoted at conferences, retreats, and parish missions. Her story, a tale of an unassuming woman chosen for a task too great for her strength, became a point of inspiration for those who felt that their own smallness disqualified them from serving God. Spiritual directors often shared her struggles with penitents who felt overwhelmed by guilt or the weight of expectations, reminding them that holiness grows not from perfection, but from trust. Her obedience in the face of misunderstanding encouraged priests and religious who faced their own trials within the Church. And her unwavering belief in the truth of God's love became a model for lay people striving to hold on to faith amid a culture that often pushed them toward indifference. As the Church continued to navigate the challenges of the modern world, cultural polarization, moral confusion, declining religious practice in some regions, leaders increasingly spoke of the Sacred Heart as a unifying center of spiritual renewal. It was, after all, the devotion that emphasized what mattered most: the love of Christ that seeks every soul, the mercy that forgives every sin, the tenderness that binds wounds and restores hope. Bishops encouraged parishes to revive First Friday devotions, hold periods of Eucharistic adoration, and consecrate communities to the Sacred Heart. Many dioceses entrusted their evangelization efforts to the heart of Jesus, praying for the grace to love as he loved, to forgive as he forgave, and to bring healing wherever it was needed. These gestures, humble in themselves, carried a quiet power. They echoed the same promise Christ had given to Margaret Mary centuries earlier, that devotion to his heart would transform not only individuals, but entire societies. Meanwhile, scholars and spiritual writers continued to deepen the Church's understanding of Margaret Mary's mission. They explored her visions not as isolated mystical events, but as part of the broader tapestry of salvation history. They noted how her revelations resonated with Scripture, Church Fathers, and centuries of Christian contemplation on the love of God. They were fascinated by the way her life mirrored the gospel so purely, how she loved in silence, forgave in suffering, and endured misunderstanding with humble patience. Many remarked that her path, though simple, revealed a profound truth about sanctity, that God often builds his greatest works on the foundation of hidden sacrifice. Her relevance extended as well to Catholics engaged in the work of healing, counselors, spiritual directors, caregivers, and those who ministered to the dying. They found in her a patroness of compassion, one who knew how to hold pain gently and offer it to Christ. Hospice workers placed images of the Sacred Heart beside the beds of those facing their final moments, whispering prayers inspired by her trust. Chaplains spoke of invoking her intercession when comforting those whose hearts were burdened by regret or fear. In these sacred encounters, her spirit seemed to accompany them, offering the same tender assurance that had once sustained her through her darkest hours. And as society continued its restless search for meaning, the devotion she helped reveal remained a beacon, an invitation into a love that doesn't change, doesn't tire, doesn't withhold itself, a love that welcomes, heals, and renews. Through it all, Saint Margaret Mary's presence remained steady, like a quiet light beneath the larger flame of the Sacred Heart itself. Her life, once hidden, now illuminated the path for countless souls seeking refuge in Christ. And as the world moved forward, marked by uncertainties she could never have foreseen, her mission continued to whisper the same timeless truth: that no matter how far humanity may wander, the heart of Jesus waits, open and glowing, ready to embrace every soul in the fullness of divine love. In the grand expanse of history, where centuries stretch like quiet fields under a vast, unchanging sky, there comes a moment when every story reaches its final bend, a moment when what once felt scattered across years begins to gather gently into meaning. And so it was with the life and legacy of Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque, whose mission had unfolded not in the public squares of kings or the bustling avenues of scholars, but in the silent chapel of a modest convent, before the flickering presence of the Eucharistic Lord. As the Church continued moving through the 21st century, into decades marked by transformation, conflict, renewal, and profound searching, the devotion she helped reveal did not fade into the background of history. Instead, it deepened, like a well whose waters become clearer and more precious the farther one draws from its source. Her story, carried first in whispers, then in testimonies, and finally in global devotion, continued to illuminate the path of countless souls who felt the quiet tug of the heart she had come to know. At Paray-le-Monial, the place where her earthly journey had blossomed into a mission for the whole world, pilgrims continued to arrive in growing waves. They came not because they sought dramatic miracles or spectacular visions, but because they sensed that this quiet corner of France held something their spirits recognized. A tenderness, a stillness, a warmth that spoke to the deepest layers of their being. The chapel where she once knelt seemed to offer a silence that wasn't emptiness, but presence. The garden she once walked appeared to breathe with the gentleness of someone who had chosen to embrace suffering rather than flee from it. And the simple stone corridors of the Visitation monastery, worn smooth by centuries of prayer, echoed with the footsteps of uncountable souls who had found healing and peace through the devotion born there. Pilgrims often described feeling that Margaret Mary walked with them, not as a distant saint gazing down from heaven, but as a sister who understood their fears. They whispered prayers at her tomb, asking her to strengthen their trust, to help them surrender their burdens into the heart of Jesus. Some brought tears they had carried for years, others brought hopes too delicate to share aloud. Many spoke of leaving with a lighter spirit, as though the walls themselves had taught them how to breathe again. It was here, more clearly than anywhere else, that one understood how profoundly her hidden life had altered the world. She had offered her suffering quietly, without recognition, yet its fruit had become a global river of grace. Her influence extended not only through devotional life, but through the deeper theological reflections of the Church. Scholars of spirituality noted how her revelations had helped shape modern understandings of divine mercy, influencing saints like Thérèse of Lisieux, Faustina Kowalska, and countless others whose writings emphasized the tenderness of God. They observed that Margaret Mary had been a precursor to the spiritual renewal that would later flow through the Divine Mercy devotion, the emphasis on the Eucharist in the 20th century, and the Church's growing recognition of the heart as the central symbol of Christ's identity. They wrote that she had helped unveil a dimension of God's love that had long been present but needed the language of her humility to be understood anew. Her visions were not simply mystical experiences. They were invitations for humanity to rediscover the emotional and relational depth of God, a depth symbolized in the burning, wounded, ever-open heart of Christ. As time continued its onward march, her life became increasingly relevant to the faithful facing the complexities of modern life. Parents burdened by worries for their children found comfort in consecrating their families to the Sacred Heart, trusting that divine love would fill the places where their own efforts fell short. Couples struggling with communication or forgiveness looked to the Sacred Heart as a source of reconciliation. Young adults, overwhelmed by expectations and uncertainties, turned to the devotion as a reminder that their worth lay not in achievement, but in the unwavering affection of Christ. Even those who felt distant from the Church found in the Sacred Heart a gentle threshold, a place where they could return without fear of judgment. Margaret Mary's message grew especially meaningful for those facing pressures of identity and self-worth. In an age where the human heart was often pulled in countless directions toward success, comparison, independence, and self-criticism, the Sacred Heart offered a place to rest. It reminded believers that they were loved not for what they produced, but for who they were. It assured them that Christ knew their contradictions, their failings, their complexities, and loved them through all of it. This understanding, rooted deeply in Margaret Mary's own struggles, became a balm for those who felt fragmented spiritually or emotionally. Her writings, simple yet steeped in surrender, were frequently shared in spiritual direction and counseling. Many found themselves returning to her words, that the Sacred Heart asks not perfection, but trust. The devotion also continued to shape the Church's mission of mercy in the world. Organizations inspired by the Sacred Heart, schools, hospitals, shelters, and communities of religious, continued to carry out their work with the tenderness that Margaret Mary had embodied. Their guiding principle remained the same: to love as Christ loved, to help heal the wounds of the world with patience, compassion, and justice. In refugee camps, volunteers distributed small images of the Sacred Heart as tokens of hope. In prisons, chaplains spoke of Christ's wounded heart as a symbol of forgiveness. In regions affected by war or natural disaster, missionaries invoked the Sacred Heart as a source of courage and solidarity. Everywhere the devotion spread, it seemed to carry the quiet light of the Visitation nun, whose life had been one long act of reparation. As the Church approached new pastoral challenges, shifts in culture, questions of conscience, divisions within communities, many bishops turned again to the Sacred Heart as a source of unity. They encouraged their dioceses to revive the practice of consecration, believing that the heart of Christ could bind together what human efforts struggled to reconcile. Parishes held evenings of adoration, inviting the faithful to bring their fears and frustrations to the Eucharist. Conferences and synods reflected on how devotion to the Sacred Heart could serve as a model for pastoral tenderness. And through it all, Margaret Mary remained a steady companion, quiet, humble, yet unmistakably present. Her story also attracted renewed interest among those searching for their own vocations. Young seminarians and novices were moved by her perseverance through misunderstanding. They saw in her an example of fidelity amid the complexities of ministry. They prayed for her intercession during moments of doubt or discouragement, trusting that she understood the delicate balance between obedience and interior struggle better than most. Her hidden life became a reminder that vocations are sustained not by admiration or accomplishment, but by the daily decision to trust that God's love is enough. In academic settings as well, her mysticism was studied with fresh insight. Researchers explored the psychological dimensions of her visions, the symbolic richness of the Sacred Heart, and the historical context that shaped her writings. Yet, even in these scholarly conversations, one theme emerged repeatedly: that Margaret Mary's influence could not be understood by intellect alone. Her impact lay not in her eloquence, nor in her theological precision, but in the authenticity of her surrender. She had allowed herself to be shaped entirely by the heart of Christ, and in that self-giving, she had become a conduit of divine tenderness for the world. And as years continued to pass quietly, gently, like the turning of pages in a book few realized they were reading, her legacy grew not louder, but deeper. The world, in all its distractions and anxieties, still needed what she had offered. A reminder that at the center of faith lies not complexity, but love, not fear, but mercy, not isolation, but communion. It needed the truth she had lived with such fragile courage, that the Sacred Heart of Jesus remains open to every soul, no matter how wounded, uncertain, or weary. By the time the Church looked back over the centuries and traced the path of this devotion, from the small chapel at Paray-le-Monial to cathedrals around the world, from handwritten letters to global pilgrimages, from moments of hidden suffering to movements of ecclesial renewal, it became clear that Margaret Mary had not been merely a messenger. She had been a vessel of something timeless, something that never truly left the world even after her death. Her life had revealed, in the quiet language of surrender, that God's love is the one constant capable of transforming hearts, families, societies, and centuries. And so her story, which began in obscurity and unfolded in hidden sacrifice, now continued in the hearts of millions. The Sacred Heart beat on, in chapels, in homes, in whispered prayers, in the quiet conversions that no history book will record. Its flame spread softly from one generation to the next, lighting the way for souls seeking peace. Through it all, the gentle presence of Saint Margaret Mary remained a steady companion, a reminder that the deepest mysteries of faith are often revealed not through grandeur, but through a humble heart surrendered entirely to divine love. And as long as the Church continued to seek the heart of Christ, her mission would live on, ever new, ever needed, ever unfolding in grace.